wasn't passing. They had lesions that resulted in either trim or loss of the primal cut. You know, if you go to the store and buy 4 tires and 3 of them are okay and one's bad, you're not happy. And yet that's what we were doing to the retailers. 1/4 of the top butts that went out there were unacceptable. So BQA decided this is something we need to tackle. So what they did is they went to work on it, and through educational initiatives and through the BQA program of making producers aware that we cannot use the top butt as an injection site, look at what happened. In 8 years, actually this was a 2000 audit, so in 9 years we went to, I don't know, 2 or 3%. When producers are aware that we're creating a problem, we go fix it. But that's the point. We have to be aware of those things that we need to fix. So here's some things. This was a remarkable thing to me. This is something that I learned. Here's a blackleg vaccine, a 2cc blackleg. Do we give calves blackleg at 50 days of age? Sure. How old are calves when we brand them? Oh, heck, they're from what, 2 weeks up? I mean, generally, I suggest when people ask me, how young should a calf be before, when I work them in the spring? I've always told them, you know, if you're comfortable dragging those calves, I work them. If you feel like I'm a little concerned about dragging that particular calf, then I wait and leave them to the fall. But if you look at that, if we vaccinate them with blackleg at 50 days of age, and then we harvest those cattle 350 days later, 73% of them had an injection site blemish that resulted in trim. 73%. But when we went to and of course we all used the 5-leg blackleg forever, right? 93% of the calves that received a blackleg, 5cc blackleg in the muscle had a lesion that resulted in trim when they were harvested 350 days later. Why was that happening? Well, we didn't know. We had no idea that we were doing that. So when we went to 5cc's to 2cc's, was that a problem for us? It was. It was hard to make that adjustment, wasn't it? And why was that? What was the biggest reason for that? It's because it didn't feel the same, right? When we gave a 2cc injection, it didn't feel like a 5cc, and we didn't feel like we were doing anything. So heck, we didn't want to do that. We didn't want to go to 2cc. But you look at that, 93% of them, when we talk about 200 days of age, roughly, that's about when we wean cattle, right? Wean calves. Okay, so when we're weaning them, if we hit them with blackleg in the muscle, half those calves had a lesion when they were harvested, which is about 200 days later, roughly, because basically they're 400 plus or minus days of age when they're most of our commercial cattle are harvested. But if you look at that, this is quite less, but why? Well, they were old enough to handle it better. But look at this, a 5cc, 80% of those calves still had a lesion. When we look at, we know this antibiotic, obviously, this is a project that was done at CSU, but so they didn't put names on, but we know that that's LA200. So if you give LA200 in the muscle at branding, half those calves have a lesion. At weaning, 92% had a lesion. Did we do that to calves? Was it common to give them a shot of LA200 when we weaned them? It was pretty common. But look at what we were doing. So what will cause a blemish? What causes an injection site blemish? Everything. If you look at saline, you all know what saline is? That's a salt water that's traveling in your veins and is in your fluid and stuff like that. Saline is a salt solution that the body makes. If we took saline and we injected into the muscle, 14% of those calves had a lesion a blemish that resulted in trim. So the point is, why do they get an injection site blemish? Now, if you stop and think about it, if you get a splinter, what happens? There's redness, pain, swelling, heat, fluid, right? Or those, probably closer to you, what about an abscess? Y'all see abscesses all the time on cattle. What happens at that abscess site? It gets a capsule, right? And it's kind of thick and hard. Inside there is the abscess. but there's pain, swelling, it's signs of inflammation. If you put a needle into a muscle, there will be an injection site blemish because you injured tissue, and the body will respond to that. So the question is if we do things correctly, we minimize that blemish to where basically it may remain microscopic and it's not really of any concern. But we got to be clean and careful to do that. So if you take and put a needle in an animal, there will be a blemish that results from it, even though it may remain microscopic, because we can't put something in there and disrupt tissue without bringing in the signs of inflammation, and with the signs of inflammation come fiber. So everything causes a blemish, basically. The question is, does it affect the quality, or do we injure our product by doing these things? And if we're clean and careful, we can do that without really injuring our product. So there's a blackleg scar. You want to eat that one? Not so much, right? See, the thing is, and especially fiber, I showed you that piece of gristle that was on that one steak. You got to understand, there's a lot of steaks that are affected by that. And the reason is the fiber has to migrate to the site. There's little chemical messengers that are released at the sites of inflammation that say, hey, we need some fiber in here. And so it's going to call fiber in as the response. And that fiber has to travel to get up there next to that lesion. So if you take and cut that steak, these steaks, away from the lesion, how much of the area is affected? So what they did is they looked at tenderness from a tenderness standpoint. What they did is they'd shear that piece of meat with what's called a Werner-Bratzler apparatus. It was the Werner-Bratzler shear force value. And then they gave meat to consumers and asked them, do you think this is tender? Or do you think this is tough? And they came up with a numerical value where consumers said, we think this is tender. And basically it was anything that was less than 10. If it was more than 10, they thought that piece of meat was tough. So when they did serial cuts from an injection site blemish and measured that shear force value, this is what they found. On the lesion, the value was 30. But you look at this 3 inches away, it's still 12.8. So 3 inches away from the visual lesion, it was still considered tough by the consumer. Well, we got 3 inches one side of the lesion, we got 3 inches the other side of the lesion. Now all of a sudden we have a lesion, we got 6 inches of product that's affected from a single injection site blemish. And it's the tenderness that's affected. Non-visual, it's not something you can see, but it affected the quality. So the point is, and I'll say this multiple times, what is our objective as cow-calf producers? We strive to never put a needle in the muscle, right? When do we put a needle in the muscle of an animal? When the label requires us to. If the label says, I am, that's where you give it. You don't give it sub-Q, you give it in the muscle. But if we're going to give an injection in the muscle, we got to think. We got to make sure we use the proper needle and we're clean, because we don't want to carry anything else in there with us that creates more inflammation. So this is a soapbox that I tend to get on. As cow-calf producers, we have a window into a calf's immune system that nobody else in the world has. Nobody down the supply chain will ever have that window that we have to influence the immune system of a calf. And with some current research that's been going on the last couple of years, we're finding out that that little window that we have has an effect on those calves all for the rest of their life. It's that important. And that cattle in feed yards who didn't receive adequate colostrum or immune stimulation all the way through the feed yard up until they're harvested, there's an effect on them because of that. So as cow-calf producers, we have a responsibility, especially for disease prevention, because if we never have to give a calf a shot of antibiotics, we've never damaged that carcass, have we? We don't have to worry about residues or anything like that if we never have to use those products. So it behooves us as cow-calf producers to do everything we can to enhance the development of an immune system in a calf so that it never gets sick. That's really what our goal should be. Blackleg vaccine should only be given sub-Q. To the defense of the pharmaceutical companies, once this information came out about how we were damaging the muscle because of blackleg, they got all over it. They jumped in and they did the additional work to get label approval to be able to move those vaccines to under the skin. So if you're using an intramuscular blackleg vaccine today, you need to change, because we have great products that are sub-Q. And if a product is labeled for IM or sub-Q, always give it sub-Q, because we want to refrain from putting anything into our product, if at all possible. So when we talk about grading along with quality of the product, obviously quality grading, and maybe some of you are familiar with this system, but USDA quality grade we know quite a bit about. It is based on two factors and two factors only. It's the amount of intermuscular fat. What's another name for that?
Marbling.
Marbling. Yeah, do we like marbling? Yeah. No, we pretty much love marbling. That's the deal. We love marbling because that's the fat that tastes good. That's what gives beef its rich and robust flavor, is that intermuscular fat that's there. And the age of that animal. Physiological age of that animal. It doesn't matter what its birth certificate says, it's the physiological age of that carcass. And so to be eligible for these grades, which we're pretty much familiar with, prime, choice, select, and standard, they have to be A and B maturity only. If they are over B maturity, they are not eligible for these grades, and they go into a commercial utility cutter or canner grading system. So then, why? A lot of this has to do with, like, for instance, the Asian markets. A maturity is 30 months or less. So to be eligible to go to Asian markets to be exported, they have to be A maturity. B maturity was 30 to 42 months. Well, just as a side note, you know why we feed and harvest younger cattle now? There was one product that changed the beef industry right at the turn into the 1900s. There was a product that was developed that changed the way the beef industry was able to feed cattle, and that was blackleg vaccine. Up until that point, until O.M. Franklin developed a commercial blackleg vaccine, they couldn't feed young cattle because they couldn't stop blackleg in them. It's remarkable to me that somebody would suck fluid out of a dead calf that just died of blackleg and got the idea, if I'm going to inject it in somebody else to save their life. Pretty bizarre, but that's what he did. The first blackleg vaccine was developed and tested in Amarillo, in the panhandle of Texas, and they vaccinated 50,000 head of calves with it and took them on and found out they could feed calves if they gave them that blackleg vaccine. Otherwise, they were always eating cattle that were several years old, right? That was the standard practice, was to basically feed the cattle that survived, so they'd be 3 or 4 or 5 years old before you ate them. Now we eat young cattle because of blackleg. Anyway, I thought that's interesting. So that's the age of maturities. They determined that right at the tip of the chine bone. It's hard to see. You can see that red spot that's right there. That's a center of ossification that's still trying to calcify. So it's not completely calcified yet, which tells you you're right at the borderline, because it's almost calcified but not quite. So this is a borderline AB maturity carcass. So what's borderline AB? It's right around 30 months, right? That's how they tell. So when they go through there, and how many of you ever been through a harvest plant, a commercial harvest plant? It's a remarkable process. You know, just when we talk about, and especially when we talk about bruising towards the end, at JBS at the plant at Greeley, I was up there a couple of years ago, and if they stop the chain for any reason whatsoever, it costs them $200 a minute in labor costs alone. Labor only, $200 a minute. So they don't want to stop that chain. So if they have bruises, what do they got to do? Depends on how big it is, but they have to trim that bruise, and it has to be fast enough or else they have to stop the chain. So there's things that we want to look at. So when we look at this marbling score, so if the age of the carcass allows them to go into the Prime Choice Select standard grading system, then it's based on marbling. How much marbling is there? They're still abundant, which is over here, moderately abundant, and slightly abundant is what your primes are. So it used to be visually graded. There was a USDA grader, and what they do is they cut that carcass between the 12th and 13th rib, and they call it ribbing them, and then what they do is that cut section sags down just a little bit. And what it does, that cut surface is exposed to oxygen, and then it goes on a serpentine chain for a little bit, or what they call a bloom chain, because the exposure of that cut surface of the meat to oxygen makes the meat redder and the fat whiter. So it was easier for a USDA visual grader to grade the amount of marbling because the meat was red and the fat was white. Now, obviously, it's computer analyzed, and now what they do is they have somebody on the backside, and he turns that carcass so that the grader, he just runs a camera over that cut surface and takes a photograph of it. And then the next half of that carcass goes by, and then here comes a new carcass, and he runs it over. And of course, they're this far apart. But what is remarkable is as soon as those cattle are shackled and raised up to a trolley, that trolley has a barcode. And that barcode is read throughout the plant. And so from the moment that animal enters the harvest facility and is raised up, they know where every bit of that animal goes in the process. Through the barcoding that's associated with it. So if they have a box of New York steaks and there's 12 steaks in there, on the barcode it'll tell them which animals those 12 steaks came from. It may be one, it may be several. But those plants know exactly which calf, every bit of meat from that animal, where it goes. And what's remarkable about it is they know, because the records that they get from the feed yard, they're required. The feed yard feeds them the information, so they know exactly which pen it was in, which lot number, and what that individual animal's tag number is. Every single carcass that goes through there. So does it matter? You bet. We have choice. You look at that this is still graded choice, but there's not a lot of marbling in that piece of meat, is there? So from a quality standpoint, to be eligible for the select grade, they can only be a maturity. They have to be less than 30 months age to be able to grade select, because they only have slight marbling. Okay. Yield grades. Yield grades are kind of a different concept. It's about, it's when that carcass is hanging there on the rail, it's how much of that carcass is going to be cut into primal cuts. How much of it is a sellable red meat and how much of it is trim. There are several factors that determine that. Heart, carcass weight, back fat, ribeye, and percent internal organ fat go into figuring out what is the yield grade of this particular carcass. And obviously, because back fat, it's not in the muscle, so what happens to it? It's trimmed. Does it have the same value as red meat? No. So there's lost value with that carcass depending on how much they have to skive off. Do they use that fat that they trim off? Absolutely. I mean, they use everything on a carcass, right? Including the lips, feet, everything. I mean, everything gets used. So, but it doesn't have the same value. That carcass, if it's abnormally fat, has less value. And the reason is it's the cutability that's affected by that, and I'll show you a slide here in a second. Yield grades go from 1 to 5. The way I remember it, yield grade 5 is fat. So 5 is going to have a lot of fat on it. A 1 is going to be really lean. Is there a market for yield grade 1s? Sure. There's a market for everything. Another soapbox moment. What about organic beef? Should we be selling organic beef? Absolutely. If somebody wants it, we should supply it. Whether it be organic beef, grass-fed beef, specialty beef, it doesn't matter. If somebody wants to eat beef, we ought to make it available to them. Because what's their choice? If they don't get to eat beef, they have to eat a darned old chicken. And that's a shame that we make them do that. So everything is marketable. But from a quality standpoint, especially when we talk about co-cattle, there's some things we ought to pay attention to maybe. So when we look at the cutability, that yield grade 1, of course it's going to have a high cutability because we're not taking a lot of trim off of it. Whereas our 5s are. But you look at that, that's a 7% difference in that carcass weight that's trimmed between a 1 and a 5. So what are our targets? We want to be somewhere in the middle, right? We got to feed them enough that they have enough cover and enough fat in that muscle to grade. But we don't want too much that we end up trimming it. So there's some optimal things there. And the big thing from a quality standpoint, we can influence these factors. Carcass quality traits are highly heritable. So we can make a difference in one generation. Does that mean you got to turn your cow herd over? No. One generation through bull selection can greatly influence carcass traits because it's what's its heritability? Sid, do you remember? Like 40%? I think it's considered. I think carcass traits are figured like 40% heritable. So I mean that's pretty high. One generation we can make things better. But how do you know what your carcasses are doing? Do you have any idea? Do you get information back from the folks that buy your cattle and feed them? Do you know what your carcasses are doing? Maybe you don't need to make any changes. Maybe they're hitting home runs with your calves when they get them fed out. And if that's the case, maybe you need to be aware of that. Because if they're hitting home runs, maybe they need to share a little. They're not going to come back and tell you, you know what, I think, you know, we did so good on those calves, I think I'm going to give you a little more. Anybody ever had that happen to you? No, probably not so much. But if you don't know what your cattle are feeding like, you may be missing an opportunity.